This year, I am experimenting with almost 40 different varieties of tomatoes because I want to see what grows well in our shorter season, colder climates, what's going to produce the earliest, as well as what's more resistant to diseases and stress. And even though I don't love fresh tomatoes, I'm learning to try to like them. So this year, when everything's ripened, we're going to do a taste test of all these varieties to see what really tastes good too. So it is the beginning of July, and most of these tomatoes I started from seed at the end of March and then transplanted out at the end of May into the beginning of June. We'll start down here with our large tomatoes, and then we'll work our way up to the cherry tomatoes, and finally last our circle of tomatoes. These ones are all my very large slicer tomatoes. I have planted them kind of beside each other in groups of colors so I can really compare. This first section here are all my paste tomatoes. So these ones are an Elizabeth Roma, and then we have a San Marzano and an Amish paste. I have 4 of the Elizabeth Romas, and as you can see, so we have the Elizabeth Romas are crazy tall. In reading the description for them again, they can grow up to 10 feet tall. The other ones are a little bit shorter, but of course still pretty large. Now if we look for fruit, these Elizabeth Romas are really putting on some good big fruit. And then next to our San Marzano, if we look in here, they have some tomatoes as well. A little bit on the smaller side, but really nice groups of them. We'll see how those turn out. And then here are this one is a San Marzano as well. So we have 1, 2, 3 for the Amish paste as well. They're kind of where the San Marzano are at. But we're getting lots of tomatoes on there. So comparably wise, I think the Elizabeth Romas are doing a little bit better. Again, they're super tall, so depending on how much space you have, that might not be an option. Beside our paste tomatoes, I've put my darker tomatoes. We have a Cherokee Purple, Paul Robeson, Black Crim, and then a Sunflower Flare. Now they're all kind of doing pretty good. The Cherokee Purple are a lot shorter. Can't really tell by much here, but I've noticed as they've grown, they're pretty short. And we're getting some pretty good tomatoes on there. Lots of blossoms, even though they're a bit smaller. We go over to the Paul Robeson, and it's a little bit bigger. It seems to be a little bit more stressed. Like this, they do this when they're stressed than the other ones. See, there's blossoms. Look at this one, a big fasciated blossom. I'm gonna have to come in and do some more pruning, but I don't really see much for tomatoes on these guys at all yet. Something to note. Oh, there's one. That's the size of the tomato on the Paul Robeson. And then next door to that, we have the Black Crim. This one is really small. This one's pretty tall. And again, I don't really see much. Like this one's got some blossoms, but I don't see much for tomatoes on these Black Crim here yet. Next door, we have the Sunflower Flare, which has lots of blossoms on. And if we go over here, we have tomatoes, and they're so cool looking. Even at this young stage, they've all really got that purpley kind of color to them. Really neat looking tomato. I'm excited for this to grow big. Front row, the last 2 we have here are the green tomatoes. These first ones are an Aunt Ruby's German Green, and then I have a Green Zebra. I back up here a bit because these Aunt Ruby's German Green are a very big one as well compared to the Green Zebra, which are a lot shorter. And if we look in here again, they're just kind of starting to put off their little tomatoes. Here's a bit of a bigger one. The Aunt Ruby's German Green are going to be a lot of a bigger tomato compared to the Green Zebra, which is more of a medium sized. But we've got some tomatoes coming on this one too. Really interesting to see the different flavors this fall once we can actually harvest some. It's the beginning of July here, and I do not have any ripe tomatoes. I know some people in my climate do, and I'm going to be trying a few different varieties next year. But for me, normally it's pretty much the end of July, beginning of August before I'm really having any ripe tomatoes. And then in the back row, these first little ones are like my red or pink tomatoes. I have 4 of these Hungarian Heart, which became highly recommended from somebody in my area. And again, they are, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, very tall. They're looking pretty good. They have lots of blossoms. They're getting some fruit set, and you can see it's a different shape. They're an ox heart shape. And then next over is a Ponderosa Pink, and it's kind of a big pinkish tomato, and we're getting a pretty good sized tomato on there. And they're not quite as tall as the Hungarian Heart. And over here I have a bunch of the kind of an orangey and then into some yellows. These ones are called an old German, and they're a pretty big plant as well. And they've got lots of blossoms. Let's see what they've got for fruit in here. And yes, if you're wondering, tomato is technically a fruit. But yeah, they've got some all right little tomatoes going on in there. Next, we move on to the Thornburns terracotta. And that one as well has set some fruit. These ones are doing a lot of cat facing, those fasciated blossoms. So we'll see how much nice fruit I get from them, but they're pretty good size. Beside that, we have our hillbilly potato leaf, and it's a potato leaf because you can see it looks like a potato leaf as opposed to a tomato leaf. They're all potatoes, tomatoes, they're all nightshades, so the same family. So this is the hillbilly potato leaf, and it's doing good as well, starting to set its fruit. Again, these weird ones with the fasciated blossoms. It happens on a lot of heirlooms. I'm growing a lot of heirlooms. We'll see how they turn out. And then next over beside that, we have the gold medal, and it's bigger. These hillbilly potato leaves are a little smaller. This one's a little bigger than that, and it doesn't quite have as many blossoms, but it is starting to put on some tomatoes there as well. And that's the gold medal, so they're kind of a yellowy orange one. And beside that, I have the lemony, and it's got quite a few good looking tomatoes in here. And it's a little bit bigger than the other plants as well, growing up tall. A few more blossoms, which is nice to see. Because you see this one, this is the lemony, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 per cluster. But if we go back here over to the lemon boy, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4. So not quite as many on each cluster. Lastly, at the end here, these are called the Golden King of Siberia. And when reading the description, it says that they are a very sad looking plant, which I can concur. They always look like they're just kind of sad, but they've been growing really good. You can see we have lots of little tomatoes on here. So we're going to be able to get a good harvest off of these ones. And then we'll be able to compare. We have all the different yellows and colors, bigger ox hearts, paste tomatoes, dark tomatoes, and green tomatoes. We'll probably be well into August before we can actually try them all, but it's nice to see as they grow kind of where they're all at. Let's go up and check on the cherry tomatoes now. Before we head to our cherry tomatoes, let's take a quick pit stop at these Kalinka Malinka tomatoes. Now these are a super determinate tomato. So in case you didn't know, there's determinate or indeterminate tomatoes. A determinate tomato grows to a certain height, usually around 4 feet, produces a certain amount of blossoms, and that's it. Whereas an indeterminate tomato will grow high. It's like a vine. It keeps growing and growing 6 to 10 feet, and it will produce throughout the season. A lot of times the indeterminates in our short season cold climates, they don't really have a chance to produce a bajillion tomatoes like they would say in the south, but a lot of those big heirloom tomatoes are indeterminate, so I grow both up here. Now, a super determinate, this plant only grows about 2 feet tall, but it produces like crazy. And then of course there's also dwarf and micro dwarf tomatoes that only grow to be like a foot to 18 inches. In this bed here, this is 5 tomato plants. Now I have not trimmed them very much. I will probably get in here and trim them off a little bit because it could get lots of diseases. But there are a ton of tomatoes on these plants. If I look in here, you can see we've just got clusters all over the place. There's a nice big one down in there. These ones are like for our climate, for a cooler climate. I believe they're like a Russian tomato. And they are just putting off a ton of tomatoes. So these 5 tomato plants are going to produce a lot of tomatoes for us. Over here, all down this backside, I have planted our cherry tomatoes. Since I didn't have enough, I bought these guys on clearance, $2 the other day, because they're a Sweet 100, which I do not have any of, and I'd like to try. They're going to be a little behind, but they'll come around. And this is just a random extra. I have more down below of these ones as well. Now we're getting into the cherries. These are a sun gold. I have 2 here, 2 there. Like I mentioned earlier, is that I'm not a big fresh tomato eater, but these sun golds are helping me learn to love it because they're really good. I will eat like 1 or 2 of them and actually enjoy it. So we plant a lot of those. They're also very prolific. They produce a ton. So with 4 plants, we're going to have enough to give away to family and friends. And they're growing really nice. You can see we already have quite a few little tomatoes coming, and these cherry tomatoes ripen a lot faster than those big ones. So again, over here, these are two more of the sun gold, and they have little cherry tomatoes all over the place. Next to that, we have two sweet gold. They're supposedly comparable to the sun gold, so I wanted to try those ones. They're a little bit more behind. I mean, we do have actually, oh, down in here. So they're probably actually about the same. Down in here, we can see there's a couple of tomatoes. They might be a little bit taller than the sun gold, but the sun gold has way more clusters of flowers. Next to that, we have a yellow pear. We're not a big fan. I know a lot of people like the yellow pears. I find the sun golds have a lot more flavor, but we grow them anyways because it's nice to have a variety. And then next to that is a sunrise bumblebee, and it's kind of probably about the same. We're getting lots of little tomatoes coming in on there. It's quite a bit shorter though, so I guess if you don't have as much space, you could probably grow it in a container or something easier. Next we have what's called a Gandalf. Again, this is that potato leaf variety, those big leaves. Now this is supposed to be a variegated variety. You can kind of see these spots on this leaf that's supposed to be there. There's not much variegation on it. I'm not sure if more will come, but I mean, you can see a little bit, but it's not quite as dramatic as I expected. That's okay though. It's really just here for producing tomatoes, and they have flowers, but I don't really see any actual tomatoes set on that one. Next door to that is an amethyst cream. It's quite a bit taller and it's just starting to set its fruit as well. And next to that is an amethyst jewel. I think the amethyst jewel is actually a larger tomato. It was really small, so I just threw it up here with these guys. If you look down in here, there is a tomato forming and it's pretty big. So yeah, I'm pretty sure this is a bigger tomato, but that's okay. Next to that, we have a black strawberry. It's one plant, but I've got two like leaders coming off of it. I need to tie this guy back up. You can see in here, we've got a strawberry. That's called a black, sorry, we've got a tomato. Variety is black strawberry, and it's actually growing nice and big. Now next door, we have the atomic grape, which my daughter really liked last year. It is very finicky, even as a little seedling. Like, it looked pretty like wiry, wispy, sad. Can be very dramatic, but I mean, it's still producing. It hasn't died. See if we can find any tomatoes in here yet. I don't really see any tomatoes quite yet on there, but we have flowers which should be setting into tomatoes very shortly. And then lastly, there's four. They're called a gobstopper tomato. They got transplanted way later because I had one that died. And they're growing really good. They're just starting to put off some blossoms there. So they're a little farther behind, but hopefully we'll get a few tomatoes from them. Another pit stop before we get to our circle of tomatoes is I have these 3 hanging baskets. These are called a Rosy Falls hanging basket tomato. They're not looking the best. They almost look like they're dying, but what actually happened is I used some of my homemade nettle tea, but I did not dilute it, and it was a lot stronger than I thought, and I kind of burnt them. But that's okay because they'll come around. And here, I'm just gonna step over here. You can see there are a ton of tomatoes on here. So I think they'll work through it. I'll just keep watering them with straight water. Here we have finally arrived at our little circle of tomatoes. These were planted more at the beginning of June, so later than the other ones. And some of these are the determinate tomatoes, so they're not going to get as big. But they're still growing and we're getting tomatoes off of them. So let's take a look at what we have here. So these first ones are a Tibet early. Again, so they're kind of for the colder climate. And they have lots of blossoms, but I do not see any fruit on them yet, which is expected. I mean, these guys are later. These ones are called the Sashas Altea, and they actually, even though we planted them later, they do have quite a few little fruits set on them. So that's nice to see. These ones here are called a Julia. It's one of the few hybrids that I'm actually growing because they're highly recommended. And again, they're putting on some nice fruit already. Excited to try those ones. These 2 little sad plants are those for sun-dried tomatoes. They were like crazy. I just tied them up. So I did do a lot of pruning off of them, but they do have some tomatoes growing, and of course they're putting off more flowers up here. So that are the Stupis tomatoes, and they are putting off a lot. Got some good tomatoes on there. They're a lot shorter than some of the other plants, but I mean shorter with the same amount of tomatoes. That's kind of ideal for some situations. And then the next 2 are a Gardener's Delight. They're a little bit bigger, but they are just starting to set their fruit as well. And then next we have our Roma VFs. I've grown these for the last few years, and as you can see why, is they have really good production. You get lots of tomatoes off little plants and early. And beside that are the Scotia tomatoes. Again, I've grown these quite a bit. They're a smaller, kind of between small, medium tomato, but again, huge producers for small little plants, early maturing. I do have a couple of those micro dwarf tomatoes here in a big planter on my deck. I have two different kinds. This one is a fat frog, that's a green one, and this one is a tiny Tim, which is a red one. I've grown the tiny Tim every year for years. They produce a whole ton. They get a little bigger than that, but they are red, and most of the time, you don't have to stake these plants, they're so little, but they end up falling over from all the weight of the tomatoes. First year with these fat frogs, but they're a little bit bigger, and these ones are the green ones, so it'll be interesting to try those. They're just great little tomatoes for on your deck or in these little planters. There's the update on all the tomato varieties I'm growing this year. I'll be sure to keep you informed, and as we get some ripe tomatoes, which ones ripen fastest, and then once we really get into it, which ones taste the best. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss those. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.